Hello, welcome back to greentv.com, where I am so proud and pleased and honored to do a series called Meet the Solutionaries. I interview scientists, politicians, activists, filmmakers, authors, business people, clean tech, green biz, you name it. But most of all, scientists, because they are the ones who are telling us what's happening, and increasingly in alarming tones, appropriately, and louder and more often. I don't know if you, our viewers, heard about the IPCC report that was released this week. You may not have, because there was, of course, and is so much other news, and Ukraine, the war in Russia, Ukraine, whatever you want to call it, genocide, it's horrendous, is appropriately taking up a lot of space, but it's not okay to just keep bumping the climate news off to the side, because of course, Mother Nature is not waiting till we get our act together and can cover it appropriately. So that's what we'd like to do here. I am very honored to introduce you to two climate scientists who are new to me. I've read their quotes in various publications, but very honored to have Peter Schlosser, who is with the University of Arizona and Arizona State University. They have a fabulous program there. I just keep hearing about all the great work you're doing in sustainability and climate change and recycling and all my favorite green topics. You are the director of the Global Futures Laboratory. You just opened up recently, and you've got a great Earth Day program coming up with lots of great topics and speakers. And before we wrap up, please let our viewers know where they can find out more about that, especially if they can participate remotely. Also, you've probably seen him on MSNBC, CNN, other networks. I certainly have. Daniel Swain, another esteemed climate scientist from UCLA, another esteemed academic institution. You are with the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability Department. And I could go on many credentials here, but I want to jump right in because there's so much to talk about. So this latest report, Antonio Guterres, UN Secretary General, seems to be needing increasingly alarming language to get people's attention. The first one, I think back in August, it was last year, Code Red for Humanity. The second one was delay is death, as far as the takeaway message, at least the messages that I can't get out of my head. And most recently, it's now or never. And he said the world is perilously close to tipping points that could lead to cascading and irreversible consequences. And he listed, or there were 5 areas listed, and we're going to delve into them, especially because our scientists have expertise in these areas in particular. Of course, our Amazon rainforest, the fear is that it could become a dry savanna. Daniel's going to speak to that. Also, coral reefs, as we've heard, are dying. We just had another one, the Great Barrier Reef, a big die-off. The coral are reportedly being cooked to death. We have ice sheets that are melting. We just had a big one, I don't know if you'd call it drop, fall, melt, and it's also very much happening in Greenland as well as the Antarctic. And there's all kinds of ominous predictions about what will happen if it continues to melt at the rate we're seeing it. Also, this one is really scary and not talked about enough. The Atlantic circulation, our jet streams, the currents, we're actually, we humans are having an impact on that and could be quite catastrophic if we don't reverse course. It could lead to an ice age in Europe. Of course, we're talking about sea level rise already, but it could get that much more dramatic, along the East Coast, very populated areas like New York, Boston. And the last one, which I'd not heard about, at least explained in these terms, the snow forest disappearing from heat and fire and part beetle disease affecting trees. I didn't really know about snow forests. I guess that's talking about the boreal and other areas that are maybe not so familiar to Americans. So that's a long enough introduction.
What was actually, developing and is highlighted in that report is that we are at this point, in my view, beyond the level of 1.5 degrees at which we wanted to hold global warming. I think it's getting less and less likely, looking at the trajectories that we are on, that we can stop global warming at 1.5 degrees Celsius. We simply did not meet the requirements that were laid out in the Paris Accord in 2015, and then in the IPCC report on 1.5 degrees warming about 2 years ago, that actually told us what we would have to do to stay in that temperature range, which the main 2 things are that by 2030, we would have to cut roughly in half the emissions of greenhouse gases. The other one is that by roughly the middle of the century, 2050, 3 decades from now, we have to be at carbon net zero or net zero carbon. And if we are looking at the emission scenarios that we have, the CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere that are, of course, a direct consequence of that, we are simply not on the trajectory that we can hold that. Something really substantive beyond what I think is easily imaginable would have to happen to get back on that track. We would have had to start cutting CO2 emissions by about 6-7% per year starting in 2021. And even with the fact that we came out of the pandemic where we saw some reductions for a short period of time, we did not meet that goal. I'm almost certain that in 2022 we will not meet it. Then you can see that, you know, the percentage per year is increasing, and we are really running out of time. In my view, we have now to focus on this 2 degrees Celsius with the committed contributions to the NDCs, nationally determined contributions to the reductions. Right now, we are on a trajectory of 3.2 degrees Celsius warming rather than 1.5 to less than 2. To me, that is one of the major messages that is being brought home, not just by that report, but it highlights it. It was building up even in the report that came out a few months ago from Working Group 2. There was already discussion among many of my colleagues that I know saying that they personally feel that 1.5 had slipped away.
Yeah, I think to echo that, I think that there is a broad consensus in the climate community at this point that the 1.5 degree global temperature target is very, very likely to be exceeded. And that it's going to be a real challenge. 2 degrees even is still a very high challenge that we are nowhere near on a trajectory to meet at this point. But it is worth commenting on why we are still, or why we are sort of realizing that some of these optimistic targets from some years ago are appearing increasingly unreachable. And it's not because the climate system has necessarily itself behaved differently than we had predicted. It's because human activities, human emission of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere have continued to increase at a time when we had assumed, or at least hoped, they would rapidly begin to decrease.
So humans have not responded as you'd predicted and hoped in terms of the alarm.
Yes, essentially, it's a question. It's a question of humans and society not making the changes that we would have needed to have made to be on a better trajectory. And I think it's worth emphasizing this for 2 reasons. One, something I often hear is this notion that we've hit a global point of no return. The warming is somehow self-sustaining and increasing on its own accord, and that therefore there's nothing we can do about it. Whereas the reality is actually quite the opposite. The reason why we are having this escalating crisis is we're keeping our foot on the accelerator. So it's not that the brakes don't work, it's that we're choosing not to use the brakes. And I think that that's important, for what we think about moving forward about this. This is not an unsolvable problem, but the problem is we're choosing not to solve it. And so it's a different kind of solution space than if we were just going to throw up our hands and say, it's too late, we give up, there's nothing we can do about it. Because the reality is we can still do everything about it, but the longer we wait to do it, the worse the outcomes are going to be, and the harder it is going to be to achieve any particular desirable outcome. And I think that's relevant in the case of these tipping points that we talk about, because, in a planetary system, whether it's the Amazon rainforest or the North Atlantic overturning circulation or anything else, we don't necessarily know where those tipping points lie. We don't know exactly how much global warming it's going to take to exceed those important planetary thresholds. We may be very close right now with some of them, or we may be very far away still. But the fact that we don't know that is pretty concerning, given what the consequences of hitting really any one of these would be for the planet and for us humans.
And I just want to follow up on that, Daniel, before we go to you, Peter. What would putting the brakes on look like? And no small question, I know, but
Well, it's no small question, although in very broad terms, there is a simple answer to that. Eventually, and sooner rather than later, the amount of the emission of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere that's out of sync with the ability of the Earth's capacity to bring that carbon back out of the atmosphere, those net human emissions need to go to zero as soon as possible. Not just level off, not just decrease. If we just level off, as we sort of have recently, where there's, the emissions are still increasing, but at a slower rate than they used to be, that's nowhere near enough. In fact, it wouldn't even be enough if they were slowly decreasing, because what the atmosphere actually feels is the total amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So any increase in that amount, even if it's a decreasing increase over time, is still going to lead to continued global warming, still going to push us closer to whatever these planetary tipping points, wherever they may be. With each increment of warming, we get closer to them. And so in broad terms, the solution is to bring global carbon emissions close to zero as soon as possible. In practical terms, of course, that is easier said than done, although we do have, today, essentially all of the technology that we would need to do that. It's really a matter of political and societal will to actually solve the problem.
yes, and Peter.
Well, I actually wanted to comment on that. Daniel is right that we have options to counter the present trend, and it is societal will, as I often also shorthand it, that prevents us from going there. We, in essence, know how to transform the energy system. We even see that alternative energy, renewable energy, is cheaper than some of the energy that we produce in the conventional way, which is heavily based on burning fossil fuels. We also know, in principle, how to take carbon back out of the atmosphere. So the options are in front of us. The key question then is, why are humans not picking them up? And that includes individual choices, but also choices of groups, nations, global society. And I think in part it is that people, we are creatures of habit. We think that if we have to make different choices than the ones we made that got us into that predicament, that we will sacrifice without really defining exactly what that sacrifice would be. But there is that fear that we would be worse off if we are not making different choices. The truth is that we actually might be much better off making different choices right now. And in fact, you could say, if we are not making different choices, we might move towards the ultimate sacrifice, which is that the planet will start to self-regulate, and our options to determine and shape our future will be minimized. And that is, and coming back to, where is that point, and what Daniel said, we don't exactly know where these thresholds are, often called tipping points, but we know that they are out there. They might not be that far away. I often say it feels like we have pushed our planet deep into the buffer zone, not just in climate, but also in climate. It feels like driving a car on red, not knowing how big our reserve tank is. And that is a very uncomfortable situation to be in. And typically we react to that when we are in the car. But here, because it is a little bit more abstract, we don't see it like that. We still hope, many of the people hope, that there is that little bit of time that, things did not fall apart altogether during the past 10, 20, 50 years since we are talking about it. So let's just see if we can drive it a little bit further, not knowing that, yes, the system, might let us go a little bit further. But at this point, we are actually in the danger zone, and we have absolutely no time left.
And when people say that, though, and I don't have to tell you experts that, it's not off in the distance, we're already seeing the impacts. I mean, look at the coral reefs dying off, look at biodiversity dying off, look at the extreme weather. I mean, how can you not see it? It's here now. And if we're still not taking the action needed, like, my goodness, what do you think it will take? I hate to say that because, one would have thought that what we've already experienced just in the last 5 years, if not 10 to 15, would be enough. I don't know. It's a question for psychology, sociologists, as well as climate scientists. But gosh, we're really up against it, and one has to wonder just what's it going to take.
And we are actually, we do know that some psychologists are actually engaging in that question, quite a few of them, also humanists. And what part of the debate is, what are we reacting to most effectively? And it is a little bit a battle of effective versus rational decision making. And effective decision making, which is reacting to our short-term needs like daily life, putting food on the table, keeping the car going, getting the kids to school, things like that, that often wins out over our decision making that has to do with the long term, the more abstract, the things where we feel we have more time left. But increasingly, colleagues in academia, but also outside academia in research institutions, are focusing on understanding decision making as a key part of what we have to do to understand how does the brain translate into a mind, into behavior, into decision making, and how does that actually work? How can it be incentivized to move from the present trajectory into one that is more compatible with what the planet has to offer? We made a choice a while ago to live on a planet that is at least 10 times bigger than the one that we have. Well, that turns out that, as you point out, is not the case, and the planet is showing us that we are on the wrong track by displaying to us the negative effects: wildfires, bigger hurricanes, stalling hurricanes, sea level rise. I mean, we could go through all the things that you have mentioned at the beginning. These are signs that we see more frequently, closer to us, in more forms, at higher amplitudes, but they still have not yet managed to get the collective will turned around to a faster action.
Of course, the fossil fuel industry has contributed to that confusion, if you will, deliberately. Mainstream media has certainly not treated environmental news and climate change with proper proportional respect.
I mean, I think there are multiple different kinds of tipping points, and just to define tipping points, really meaning a change in a system, in the Earth system, where the behavior after reaching that point is significantly different than the behavior of the system before that point. So it's not just incremental change. You push it a little more and it changes a little more. You push it a little more, it changes a little more. At some point in some of these systems, you push it a little more and it changes a lot. So that's what a tipping point fundamentally is. And there are different kinds of tipping points, both in the physical system, so the ocean and the atmosphere and the cryosphere being the Earth's ice-covered surfaces themselves, and in the biosphere, so the living part of the Earth that includes all of the ecosystems that exist, plus us humans. And in my head, there are these sort of two classes of tipping points, some of which can really affect the whole planet, where if you hit one of these thresholds, it doesn't just change things in that particular system or locally or regionally, but across the whole world. And there are other ones that are a little bit more localized, but can be regionally devastating. And so, from that perspective, in my head, there are really three that stand out as being particularly concerning due to a combination of the fact that they would have global consequences, and also that we are either potentially quite close to them, or we really have no idea how close we are to them. Those top three would be the rapid loss of the continental ice sheets. So these would be the ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica as well, which would result in much more rapid sea level rise than is currently being projected, and that would affect billions of people who live along the Earth's coastlines very quickly. There is the potential dieback of the Amazon rainforest, whereby a drying and warming of that rainforest essentially initiates a self-reinforcing feedback loop, where the forest, which historically generates a lot of its own rainfall by re-evaporating moisture into the atmosphere and raining back out again, once you start to lose enough of that forest, you don't get as much rain, which means you lose more of the forest, and you get even less rain and you lose even more of the forest, until the point where you don't necessarily have a forest anymore at all. You might have a savanna, so grassland with trees mixed in, and that has global consequences because of what it means for the carbon cycle. The tropical rainforests sequester a tremendous amount of carbon at present, and if they collapse, they won't do so in the future. That's all carbon that would enter the atmosphere and cause, you guessed it, more global warming. And the third one that I think particularly concerns me are potential for feedbacks in the Arctic carbon cycle as well. So these might arise from the thawing of permafrost, for example, and the increased microbial activity that occurs in these newly thawed soils and marshes and peatlands, and also the fact that we're now seeing large wildfires even north of the boreal forests.
Siberia?
in Siberia. So not only are we seeing more of these boreal forest fires, which can themselves release a lot of carbon when those trees burn across vast acreages, but we're also seeing fires and methane emissions in the Arctic tundra. So places even farther to the north that were historically even colder than the boreal forests are seeing even more rapid changes. And that's sort of an emerging potential tipping point that wasn't even really being talked about all that much 5 or 10 years ago, but it's really jumped forward ahead of some of the other ones that were being talked about 5 or 10 years ago as one that really might have significant implications in the coming decades.
And in addition to the permafrost, which is not permanent anymore, melting and releasing greenhouse gases, there's also been concern about releasing viruses. Maybe that's what you're referring to. Is that a real world problem, something else we should lay awake at night thinking about and maybe doing something about?
Well, there is, of course, the question about how does the biosphere change, and what does that mean for disease vectors and for viruses. And even in the COVID discussion, there was quite a bit of discussion, was that related to climate. So there are certain things that we know, there are certain things that I think they're still relatively speculative. But on these thresholds that Daniel mentioned, and the ones that you listed at the beginning, one was the Atlantic or the meridional overturning circulation. Some people shorthand that with the Gulf Stream, and it is of course linked to freshwater input from high latitudes, which is increasing because of warming. There is an interesting point. Some people still say that will get us to an ice age. If we wouldn't have the global warming, that would be one possible scenario. In fact, if you are just looking at the past few million of years, we went from warm period to ice age to warm period. There's this regular cycle of about 100,000 years. And we, in essence, would slowly move towards, if we wouldn't put a lot of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere, towards a cooler planet if this cycle would continue. But what in all likelihood will happen with a slowing meridional overturning circulation, or a slowing Gulf Stream, if you wish to use that language, is that less heat is being transported into the northern North Atlantic, Labrador Sea, Ermine Sea, across the North Atlantic current towards Norway. That's what a lot of people say regulates the climate of the northern hemisphere, of Europe mainly. But because we have a counter effect, so if some of that heat is not coming up, we have that counter effect of warming from the atmosphere. So what in all likelihood we will see is less warming over parts of the northern hemisphere, rather than slipping back to temperatures below the average that we had before we put greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So I think we have to be a little bit careful that we are not going overboard with these things. And slipping into an ice age, in my view, is highly unlikely. Most likely what we will see is a dampening of the warming over the North Atlantic. So that's one of these features that we are seeing that are contemplating what do they mean. I'm more worried about what does a change in the internal dynamics of a major part of the ocean mean for ocean dynamics, for the biology, the ecosystems that are related to that, and the interaction with the land. So that is something where we have to pay quite a bit of attention to. But the fear going towards an ice age, in my mind, is very, it might be a little bit overdone. Personally, I feel we will not get there. We just will offset some of the warming.
Okay, we'll take
Yeah,
that.
I would absolutely.
There's still plenty to worry about. Go ahead, Daniel.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree from an atmospheric and oceanic dynamics perspective. It's not to say that the consequences of a large change in the North Atlantic overturning circulation or the Gulf Stream wouldn't have huge impacts, but I think a lot of folks think to say the movie The Day After Tomorrow, where everything just plunges into Arctic freeze. I think one of the things that's missed in this is that we've already warmed the Earth in the warm direction by about as much as it would cool in the cold direction during an ice age. So perhaps if there hadn't been global warming, then yes, something like that could plunge us into an ice age, but that is not going to happen because we've already warmed the Earth too much for that to happen in the future. And the additional component to that is the North Atlantic overturning circulation, as was just mentioned, primarily affects the temperatures in Europe. So it's actually plausible that if you did see a large disruption to that ocean's overturning circulation, you might see, as was mentioned, less warming in Europe, but much more warming across the rest of the planet in the meantime. So the Southern Hemisphere, North America, would probably warm at an even faster rate than they would have otherwise, even as Europe has dramatically more muted changes. And of course, changing those patterns and those temperature differentials would greatly affect weather patterns and extreme storms and things like that. So I think the concern there is less that it would get colder, rather than it would really just throw a wrench into almost everything. Some places would warm even faster. You'd get more extreme weather in other places. But that's one of those tipping points that we really don't, we know it can happen since there's precedent for it in the Earth's geologic history. But are we particularly close to it? We don't know, and it may not even act as a tipping point this century. Although if it did, then it would be a big deal. And I think that this notion keeps coming back with all of these conversations and all of these tipping points, which is that uncertainty is not our friend in this respect. It's not good news that we might not experience these things. I would instead frame it as alarming, even if there's only a 10 or a 20% chance of hitting some of these, as the case may be. That's a very large number, given the consequences. If you knew that there was a 20% chance that the plane you were getting on was going to crash, would you get on the plane?
I don't even like getting on one if I don't know. I'm a nervous flyer, so definitely not. Those parties or interests that would want to diminish concern about climate change or even outright denial, they often say, well, there's confusion. All the evidence isn't in. Although they haven't said that as much, they must have been a new talking point, now about, what is it that, well, it may be caused by humans, but there's not much we can do about it. We need to let the market take over. Like, just because we don't know 100% of what's going to happen, science never does. That's no reason at all there's plenty of evidence of what is already here, right? So the societal lack of response, I guess, is mind-blowing, really, isn't it not? Do you lie awake at night? I would imagine you do, because you know more than I do, and I do.
That's true. But if you look at just the question that you raised about uncertainty, and that was building on what Daniel said, I would claim that a lot of our scientific projections, although they have an error envelope, these error envelopes are much smaller than those around factors around which we make economic decisions or political decisions. We have actually quite well-defined error envelope on many of the projections that we have. So in my view, that's not an excuse to say, there is a lot of dispute. Yes, as in everything, there are sometimes voices that don't agree with, let's say, even IPCC. But IPCC has such a large input, and the consensus is really high, and it is a continuous process. It's not a one-off assessment and then you move on. It is continuing to refine it, and by now I think we have actually a fairly good picture of where the system is heading under different driving scenarios, under different scenarios of, let's say, greenhouse gas emissions. So in my view, there is no excuse to say science doesn't have it right, so we can wait until they get it right. That is really, in my view, that is a very dishonest approach to the situation that we are facing. We are seeing some of the effects. We have clear evidence that many of the projections that were done in the 80s or even before are within reasonable error envelopes, are playing out right now. We know that we have warmed the planet by roughly 1 degree Celsius. Coming back to what Daniel said, the temperature difference between a glacial period and a warm period, from which we started before putting CO2 into the atmosphere and other greenhouse gases, was about 5 degrees Celsius, roughly 10 Fahrenheit. So we are 20% of a full swing into the warmer world. Another 1 degree Celsius is almost certainly baked in. That would be 40%. So now you're half of a full cycle of a glacial into the wrong direction. That should give us pause and should say, well, even if we don't know it exactly, let's just take out some insurance policy. Coming back to the example with the plane, would you actually fly something, or would you drive a car when you have a chance of 10, 20, 30% of a major thing? So if nothing else, let's make sure that we insure ourselves against catastrophes. And this is something, people often ask when I talk about these things. Well, 1 degree Celsius, 2 degrees Celsius, I have day night swings of 10 Celsius, 20 Celsius. And then you have to really get back to saying you have to really average that. And during the last ice age, New York City, there was about 1 kilometer of ice over it. So this is not just tinkering out around the edge. We are playing with the planet on a big scale with really significant and severe outcomes that will change life as we know it.
And already is happening. And so you hear this debate back and forth, 1.5, can we keep it to 2? I almost want to scream, and you guys are the experts. I'm just like a mother who worries about her, children's future and future grandchildren. Okay, doesn't matter. We're way past where we should be. And let's just focus on what we can do. Now, you as scientists are not necessarily the ones responsible for saying what we can do, but what would you like to see happen that would just, as much as we can, slow this runaway train? And, we have to cut our emissions in half by 2030. That's 8 years from now. And we're not on that track. We're going the opposite direction. What if you were president or God, what would you make happen as quickly as possible?
Well, I think fundamentally, we really just have to make it very easy for people to make good decisions about the climate. It can't be structured as people need to make individual sacrifices, because that won't even work anyway. It won't scale up because it's not currently possible to make good enough choices at an individual level for the vast majority of people. What we need to do is make it so that societal systems make it more difficult than not to do things that harm the climate. So, the examples of this are, right now in lots of large American cities, there is no realistic way for a lot of people, especially on the lower end of the income scale, to get to their work other than driving a personal vehicle, because public transit networks are in shambles or just non-existent. They never even existed in the first place in a lot of places. So, for example, there may not be a realistic alternative for those folks right now, but what we need to do is make it so that not only is there a realistic alternative, but it's both easier, cheaper, and more appealing to use it than to continue to drive your car to work every day. That's just a very almost mundane example, but we need to do that with agriculture, with food systems, with transportation, building, electrification, just about everything. That's the broad scale solution. It's not asking people to stop using energy. It's not asking people to try and radically alter their own lives so that, to fit the constraints of the current system where we have all these massive negative externalities. It's to, at broad scale, remove those large unaccounted for negative externalities and make it really easy, trivially easy for everybody, irrespective of means and lifestyle, to make good choices that help solve the problem.
Okay, I want to hear your response, Peter. And then for our last few minutes, I want to talk about politics, because if we need systemic change and we don't have good leadership and we have the Joe Manchins of the world, or actually he's in a category of his own right now, holding up progress, what does that mean? What does that portend? Pray tell.
So on the large scale, I think what Daniel said is exactly right. What we can do as individuals on the large scale, if we keep doubling the amount of renewable energy that we install from here on out for the next few decades, by roughly the middle of the century, we can actually produce 80–90% of the energy needed through renewables. So that's one way, but it needs incentives. If we are looking at how much subsidies the oil industry has received in the past and still does, if that would be shifted into other energy forms, we actually could take the pressure off the climate system, of the emissions, by switching away from burning fossils to having renewable energy systems. And then, of course, as Daniel said, in terms of what is possible for individuals, there is actually, if you're looking at certain areas in the world, and living in Phoenix, of course, I'm in one of them, where in my view, there's actually no excuse to not have the incentives that every roof has solar panels, because they actually can put a major boost to that transformation to renewables. And I have one array on my roof that I installed. So in essence, I produce more energy than I need. There are issues of flattening the curve and all that kind of stuff, but in principle, we also know how to do that. So there are many ways along the lines of Daniel's and what I lined out that are ready right now to embark on and push forward. But leading over to what you, I think, mentioned that you want to address towards the end, it does also need political decisions. It cannot all be driven by individuals. So the political system has to do its part, because right now the private sector, in my view, is actually ahead of the political system in driving change.
And yet there's predictions that in the midterms, we're going to get more Republicans in office, and they just traditionally, it's a fact, are not big supporters or leaders on, fighting climate change and even, other environmental initiatives, taking us backwards when we can least afford it. And, the situation in Ukraine, has put more profits into the pockets of, the fossil fuel industry, the oil companies. It's just so daunting, isn't it? Like we can't seem to catch a break.
I would say, independent of the parties and of party lines, and we also see that in Europe, the political system has failed the test of guiding us into reasonable climate policies that have some teeth. And it started with Kyoto, the Kyoto Protocol. We saw that this wasn't, and then people said, well, that was just too rigid, and you can make arguments around that. So the Paris Accord is much more flexible, leaving nations their own pathway to reaching targets. This is also not on track, and it is across different political orientations. So the political system, the governance system in general, doesn't seem to work for these kind of problems. And the question then, of course, is how do you get out of that dilemma? One way I see that is, or one area that I see is picking up momentum, is the private sector. That there are quite a few companies who are moving more aggressively towards carbon neutrality, zero waste, less water use, things like that. if we want to succeed, we need the political system to become more active and to be more proactive and to be more supportive of the right incentives that would lead to a change in the way we use energy and thereby influence the climate.
We have to wrap up in just a couple of minutes, and I want you two to get back to work because what you're doing is so important. Let's try to end on a positive note. When I was in college, quite a few decades ago, or a few, yeah, long ago, environmental studies really wasn't something, that was offered, or I don't recall, I wasn't interested back then, but I was a psychology major, and boy, this takes a lot of psychology, doesn't it, to figure out. But you're both at institutions where I'm sure you're seeing increasing interest and demand in your departments, in your programs. So while I don't believe it's okay to just let, the young people grow up and fix our mess, they're calling on us appropriately, yelling at us to do our part so they can stay in school and learn. But is that something where you get some hope and encouragement that, the young people, as they should be, are most concerned? And yet, I don't think it's okay, as I say, to just wait till they come of age, because first of all, it'll be too late if we have 8 years for them to get into their professions and start. You don't turn the ship around overnight. You don't turn this mess around overnight. So anyway, just thoughts on that as we close.
I mean, I think that one of the things I actually sometimes push back against is the notion that we have 8 years, because on the one hand, we don't have even 8 years. It's already at the point where we're seeing impacts that are bad for people and for ecosystems. But on the other hand, and maybe on the more optimistic side, there's no cliff in the geophysical system that we fall off of in exactly 8 years or at any particular threshold of global mean warming. So, the bad news and the good news is we caused the problem and we can fix the problem. And it's good news, I guess I'll start with the bad. It's bad news because we're not fixing the problem on any meaningful scale yet. For all the talk we've had over recent years, net greenhouse gas forcing is still increasing in the atmosphere, and that's ultimately what matters. But on the other side of things, on the more optimistic side of things, this is not some exogenous planetary threat that we have no control over. If it were the sun that was causing it, we'd be kind of out of luck. There's nothing we could do about the sun's suddenly emitting more energy. But that's not why this is happening. It's happening because of choices that we've made historically as a society and choices that we're continuing to make as a society. And so the good news is we can alter that societal calculus and make different choices and fix the problem. There's no physical climate system or technological reason why that's impossible. And if it takes 10 years or 15 or 20 years, it's not like we've lost the fight. And so that's why I kind of tend to shy away from the "we have 8 years" language, because it's both too little, too late, and also we shouldn't lose hope if or when we haven't magically solved the problem in 8 years, because solving it in 20 years would still be an incredible success relative to the path we're currently on.
And Peter, I want to hear your thoughts, but won't it help when we raise the eco-literacy rates in this country? It really it can be astonishing when you talk to just people who are not working in the environmental community. My just normal friends I just randomly say, do you know how many parts per million of greenhouse gases are in the atmosphere now? Do you have any idea what the safe level is? And it's like, oh my gosh. And we've just not been good environmental stewards in this country, and perhaps, elsewhere. That has to shift, right? We have to put this top of mind. and even then.
I mean, there are a few aspects to what we are discussing here. Let me just build quickly off what Daniel said. I agree. We are in a way, we are in negative time, but on the other side, we don't have to be fixated on the 8 years, but we have to be cognizant that if we are not reaching the targets that we have set within the next roughly 1 decade, then the consequences that we have to battle and the situation that we have to solve will become more difficult. So there is an urgency factor in it, but it's not that 8 years or nothing. At the same time, I often say the time is now. We cannot contemplate any longer. We know enough, we have seen enough, we are seeing more and more. So there is absolutely no excuse and any reason to say we have to contemplate more. This is the moment to act. And
every little bit counts, right?
And every little bit counts. on the education, yes, we have a lack of information in the population of education in these areas. The positive thing is that if you look at movements like Fridays for Future, they are actually calling for science to inform these decisions. There are more programs now around universities, more universities bringing them in. That it's filtering into high school, it's filtering into pre-K. So there is hope that this is becoming more widespread, better understood. If you talk to the younger generation, they are much better informed than their parents and their grandparents. The question is balancing the time. And yeah, there is no exactly defined cutoff when things won't work anymore. But we have to make sure that we understand, as Daniel said, it's in our hands. We don't have to turn from deniers to lemmings, to fatalists. We have options. And hopefully this younger generation, better educated, better prepared, will help accelerate that. But we have actually the responsibility, our generations have the responsibility to help them, to facilitate them, to give them the space to do things differently than we did, rather than trying to hold them back.
And the important things I think to keep repeating are a lot of this, if not all of this, is not reversible. You know, once it tips, and then there's that cascading effect, as we've talked about, and just that, you know, the window is closing to act quickly.
It's now. But the moment is now. If we miss that, yeah, as Daniel said, it's not that everything will fall apart immediately, but it will become increasingly more difficult if we are not putting things in action right now.
Well, thank you.
I like that framing. The moment is now, I think, is a good, very succinct summary of, I think, where we are today. Now
or never, I think, was one of the takeaway messages from this IPCC third report out of a series. So yes, now or never, right? Truly. That may be an overused phrase, but, you know, never more important application than to our planet, our life support system, which is on life support. And there's a role for all of us because we can all have a positive or negative impact. I want to thank you for your roles in this evolving, emerging drama. Will humanity make it? Will we wake up and smell the carbon and get off our gases in time? Or will we just kind of watch it all go away? I know what I hope, I know what you hope, and I know what our viewers hope. So we hope that our viewers will go to YouTube and subscribe to our greentv.com channel. The more viewers we get, the sooner we can start live streaming, because as you can tell, there's oh so much to talk about. No shortage of compelling, urgent, and fascinating and interesting issues, and no shortage of challenges, but most importantly, no shortage of solutionary. So thank you for being part of our climate force. Hope we can call on you again. So wonderful to get your knowledge and expertise. And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having us.
That does it for this edition of Green TV. We'll see you next time. And please tell your friends and family about this Green TV thing. It's not for environmentalists, or not only for what I call the green crowd. It's actually for everybody. That is everyone who eats, breathes, or drinks. So I think that last time I checked, that applied to all of us. So we feel that way about it, and hope you'll spread the word. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
We'll take all of us.